This is Levon Becker. Today I'll be going over getting started with Chef. Topics we're going to be covering are the Chef ecosystem, cookbook structure, Chef configuration, community and wrapper cookbooks, local dev environment setup, which includes Chef DK, VirtualBox and Vagrant, test kitchen overview, testing, and we'll have a lab that's setting up your local environment and creating your first cookbook. Chef ecosystem recently announced is Chef Automate, which now includes workflow that used to be called delivery, visibility, and compliance all wrapped in, and then the Chef server and the solo, which was solo, then zero, then back to solo now, is your cookbook and Chef configuration management. Chef Vault is password management built in to Knife, and Chef Inspect is the new replacement for ServerSpec for doing integration tests. It is backwards compatible. You could still use ServerSpec if you've already got the specs wrote out and don't have time to upgrade to the new format. And Habitat is an application automation tool that is a package manager. It replaces like RPM and the Debian package manager. It currently only works on Linux. It does not work on Windows yet. Cookbook structure, main components are attributes, which are dynamic variables. Variables you'll set to default, but then there's the ability within your cookbook or your roles or your environment files to override, like change it to something else, such as to install or not install something. By default, maybe it does, but maybe in a specific environment you don't want it to. Recipes, generally where you use Chef DSL, so Chef specific resources like directory file, things that they built out. Generally, you don't want to do a bunch of Ruby in there. You can use the Ruby block resource, but I generally sway against that. Problem with doing Ruby in the recipes is it can get out of order during the convergence. And generally it's best if you're going to do Ruby operations to have them in the libraries. The files are static files, like a shell script that is what it is. You're not going to change it based on environment, and you just need to drop it in place to utilize. The template is a dynamic file deployment solution, so they're ERBs, and it might be a shell script, but based on environment settings or something the library goes and finds out, it might replace items in that file, such as a shell script for that specific environment. Provider and resources, where you do your custom Chef DSL, basically like there's a file to create a file or a directory to create a directory or change permissions on the directory that's built in to Chef. You can create your own, potentially like for doing a deployment, and you've got to pull from binary repo like Artifactory or whatever. There's 3 different renditions of resources. The first one was definitions, then the second one up to just anything prior to version 12.5. You have a resources and a providers directory, and then the latest one is just resources directory, and it's all 3 are completely different syntaxes. I'll be focusing on the last prior to 12.5 in the labs, just because the new isn't quite all out there. You'll run into others in community cookbooks when you're looking for examples and whatnot that are potentially the older version, and it's backwards compatible, but the only way to do the new resource or custom resources is with 12.5 or newer. So you might be at a company that's using an old version, so you couldn't use the new custom resources in that case. And like I touched on earlier when talking about the recipes and doing Ruby. Libraries are basically where you do full-on Ruby. You're not calling Chef DSLs. It's class method. The thing to know about libraries versus resources is resources you cannot get a return value, and libraries you can. So within a resource, you might simply just be calling a library to go do something to give you a return, like talk to a REST API and get some information back, or check S3 and pull it back and say, yes, I got it, and then continue on, or error out. So you basically just be doing conditioning and stuff like that in the resources. Potentially, if it's a small enough task, you might just jam it all into the resource and providers. Again, the libraries is for like pure Ruby if you're going to be calling like an AWS SDK or whatever to talk to some API and do something. That's where you'd want to do it, even if you didn't want a return value. The test folders where you have integration tests, that's where you'd have service spec or inspect, potential cucumber. The spec folder is where you have unit test, which is chef spec, which is on a wrapper on R spec. The metadata RB is where you have the cookbook name and the version and information about the cookbook, such as dependencies. And the Burks file is the Burke shelf configuration file, which by default it's going to look at the chef supermarket for cookbooks, and it's going to look in your metadata file for any dependencies and default look there, but you can configure it to if you've got local cookbooks you're working on, if you have multiple cookbooks integrated, or if you've got some on a source control like Git or GitHub. The .kitchen YAML is the default test kitchen configuration, and the .rubicop.yaml is the default Rubicop configuration for doing exclusions and whatnot, or like what folder to check or what folders not to check. Chef configurations, the three main ones are the roles, environments, and data bags. The roles are like over a whole multiple environments usually. Usually in your roles you just have a run list, the run list being what cookbooks to run. So you might have a web stack role and it runs these set of cookbooks to set up a web stack. But then you go to your environment and it's a JSON file. You can do a Ruby file, but generally most people do JSON, but you can do both, except either. And with Ruby, then you could do logic and stuff like that. But generally, in the configuration files, you don't do logic. It's just key value. But you could, but generally you should just have it in your cookbook and just needing information based on the environment to override your attributes in your roles environments. And again, the roles, so if you had a cookbook that deployed a web server, and it could be Apache and Nginx, and you had to tell it which one, and you were doing a dev QA stage prod environment of Apache, in your roles you might say, hey, I'm calling that cookbook and I want you to install Apache. Then down in your environments, maybe in dev, you add different modules that you wouldn't have in production for, say, debugging, or you crank up the logging. And that would be the specifics that you would have between dev, QA, stage prod, or if you have a UAT, or maybe you just have dev and prod. But there's potentially differences between the environments. Maybe that's where you have RDS URLs or S3 URLs. They're different for the different environments. The data bags generally is where you put secure content because you can encrypt them, such as passwords, credentials, and stuff. Never put passwords in the cookbook because it's not only in the cookbook that then's in source control, it's also on the chef server. If somebody has access to it, they can look. But you do not have to encrypt a data bag. So data bags can also be like a list of REST URLs if you wanted, if you weren't doing any kind of discovery or fetching. The data bags is actually just a folder. Data bag item is the actual JSON in the folder. So if you've got a cookbook that's foobar and you make a data bag that's going to work with that cookbook named foobar, you probably call the databag foobar or the team name. And then under it, you'd have your JSONs for like credentials or connections.json. And from your cookbook, you'd call those. A node is basically the server that runs Chef Client. If you're using Chef Server, then it's registered to it. It's basic. Even if you're using Solo or Zero, it still talks to it and considers it a node, and all the attributes that are compiled are listed as node something, which you'll see later. Client really shouldn't be used much at all. Sometimes this is confused that oh, I've got a server and I need to register it as a node and I need to register it as a client. Client is really for like an admin box that you need direct full control over or search capabilities or whatever to a Chef server. So generally you won't have any clients registered to your Chef server. And speaking of which, the Chef server is a centralized server for all of your Chef content, so your cookbooks, your roles, your environments, and your data bags. And it's a good note that roles, environments, and data bags are not versions, but cookbooks are, based on the version that you put in the metadata. So every version that you upload of your cookbook, it's saved on the Chef server, which can be useful if, particular one environment you can lock down to say, I want to use this cookbook, and this newer one, maybe dev, for instance, you want to use the latest and greatest, so you wouldn't pin the cookbook version. Chef Solo or Zero, it was named Chef Solo, then they came out with Chef Zero, which had newer functionalities, and they were trying to deprecate Solo. It basically spins up like a Chef server instance on the box in memory, and you upload all your content, your cookbook, your roles, data bags, environments, and you can perform functions as if it was a Chef server, such as doing searches through data bags. Like if you've got data bag name users, and then you've got several JSONs of different usernames, you could say, look for that bag and then search for user XYZ, and then do something with it, create it, or if it's not there or whatnot. And it's basically for standalone Chef content, because it runs one time, and then it's not the run and the OHI and all that stuff is not persisted in a central location. It's just on that box. Then later, recently, now they're going back to calling it Chef Solo, and they've just basically taken the technology that they put into Zero and put it into Solo. So now you can call Solo or Zero, and it's essentially the same thing. I think it's after 12.5, and so you can just call Solo now, and you're going to have the same functionalities if you're on a newer version of Chef Client. Community cookbooks, they're like, if you know Ruby, it's like a gem, or Java, jars. It's basically people have wrote stuff out there. So whenever you're going to set up or write a cookbook, generally what you're writing is a wrapper cookbook. You're not writing all the code to do every single thing. You're, make every directory and set every permission and create user and all that. Generally, what you're going to do is you're going to call a community cookbook that like sets up Apache or sets up Nginx, and then you read their instructions on what attributes you have to set or pass that you could do either in your wrapper cookbook and or in your environments or roles to set it up how you want it based on your environment. There's others out there that haven't registered themselves with the Chef Supermarket, so you can always search on GitHub. So setting up your local environment, you really need three things. First thing is Chef DK. The development kit pretty much has almost everything you need. You don't need to install Ruby because it comes with an embedded Ruby, comes with the Chef Zero, Chef Client, and RuboCop, the stuff for linting, Food Critic, Test Kitchen, Perkshelf, and all that comes packaged with it, and it's all been tested with each individual version against each other, so you know that you don't get out of sync with versions. And when you just default install it, to get around pathing, so if you're like on a Mac or you're on a system that has Ruby installed, but you don't want to use the system Ruby, like you don't want to install gems and start messing up your system Ruby, you use the chef space exec exec and then whatever command. So it'd be like chef exec gem install blah, or chef exec IRB, or chef exec knife, or chef exec, and it's basically just taking care of the pathing for you. That way you don't have to have RVM and or worry about any Ruby being installed. And you know that you're using the version of Ruby, you know, if you've got the right version of Chef DK installed, that's the version of that's being used on as for the Chef client, because that's basically what they do with the Chef clients. They have it embedded Ruby with it. The other two pieces you're going to need is VirtualBox and Vagrant. And VirtualBox is a free desktop hypervisor, so you can spin up virtual machines locally. And Vagrant, it automates creating those virtual machines on VirtualBox, or it can do VMware or AWS or other hypervisor machines or other cloud providers. Test Kitchen that comes with Chef DK is basically a test framework, but what it also does, one of the primary things it does, is it automates the configuration of Vagrant. So Vagrant automates creating the virtual machine, and Test Kitchen automates creating the Vagrant file, which if you've ever done it before, it's Ruby and it can get quite complicated and time consuming. This takes care of it for you based on the configurations you put in the kitchen configuration, which is the default is .kitchen.yaml. It uses Burkshelf to take care of your cookbook dependencies. So if in your metadata you say I depend on Apache 2 and I depend on Nginx and I depend on apt or yum, other community cookbooks, it's gonna by default the Burks file, when you create it using the Burks in it, it's going to look at the supermarket, it's going to look in your metadata at anything you've set to depend, any cookbooks you're depending on, and then it's going to go look at the supermarket for fetching them, and then it downloads a copy in your home directory under .burkshelf / cookbooks, I believe, and it saves all the different versions, and Kitchen just takes care of all the commands for you instead of having to do, normally you gotta, Burks install, which pulls them all down locally, or you could do several other things, but that's the main thing. It takes care of that for you, just like it takes care of the Vagrant for you. The main commands to know with Kitchen are create, that creates the virtual machine, or instance if it's EC2 or Docker. That's when it's creating the Vagrant file, running the Burks. Actually, it's not running the Burks there. It's run the Vagrant, creating a Vagrant file on the fly. Every time you run it, it rechecks its config and makes any adjustments needed to the Vagrant file from the .kitchen.yaml. The converge then runs all of your cookbook stuff. So you run all these commands from the root of your cookbook. You have to be in the root where the .kitchen.yaml is, unless you want to do some crazy stuff and point at different places and run it from somewhere else. But generally just be in the root of the cookbook and do your kitchen commands. And again, without making any pathing adjustments, you're going to want to do chef, exec, kitchen, create, blah. Converge runs your chef. So it takes your cookbook, it takes, if you've made environments and role and data bags, it takes all that stuff, uploads it to your virtual machine, whether it's EC2, Docker, or VirtualBox, and then runs the Chef client. Setup sets up all the test framework for like server spec or inspec. Verify actually runs your tests, such as server spec, and then destroy gets rid of it. Now you can run test, and it will do all the commands in sequence. It'll destroy if it's already there, it'll create, it'll converge, it'll set up, it'll verify, and it'll destroy. that's good for like if you wanted to integrate it into a CI to where it actually stands up VirtualBox, say in the cloud somewhere, and runs all your tests, and if it passed, then it destroys it. If it doesn't, it's going to error out. Then you're going to get a report back saying that it errored. Then login is makes it really easy to get onto that virtual machine. You don't need to know its IP or the port forward that's set up by the VirtualBox. You just go, chef, exec, kitchen, login, and then the name of the suite, the test suite, which you'll see later, like default -CentOS -72, and it just automatically SSHs you in. Or if it's Windows, it'll RDP you in. Again, the Converge uploads all your chef or test kitchen, does all the Vagrant configuration, does the Burke shelf commands for you, takes all your files and uploads them to the virtual machine and runs it. The thing to note that Converge, so if you make a change to your cookbook locally, you need to run Converge again. And you might run into that if you get up to the verify stage and you verified everything and you make a change to your cookbook. You can't just run verify again, you got to run Converge again, so it re-uploads your cookbook stuff and then run verify. And on that point, they do work in order. So like if you just go chef exec kitchen verify whatever test suite name, and it's not even created or converged or set up, it'll go through all those steps. It'll go create, converge, set up, verify if it wasn't already created. Also, there's a command list, kitchen list, which will list all your test suites. And the Chef Solo 0, it sets all that up and runs it all on a virtual machine. And for it to work, you do need to have internet access, because it's gonna, for the setup phase, it's gonna download gems such as the Buster gem and stuff like that for server spec. And also it downloads the chef client based on the version. If you don't specify a version in the kitchen YAML, it's going to pull down the latest and greatest. Just want to go over testing real fast. So there's 3 main pieces to testing. There's linting, unit test, and integration. Linting for chef, the 2 main tools it uses, Food Critic and RuboCop. What linting is just checking your syntax to make sure that you've wrote it how everybody thinks you should write it. So, not making methods too long, or using double quotes on a non-interpreted line and stuff like that. The Food Critic is specific to chef. It's going to check, it knows about chef DSL and its resources. So it's going to check that you have, like, if there's no default action, that there's an action in there, or if you've wrote a provider that you've told the observers that when it's done and stuff like that. RuboCop is specific to Ruby and is a community-based solution that the community says you should write Ruby in this fashion. And when you run that, it'll tell you, one way or another, if you've passed all the, what they call COPs, all the checks or not. Unit test is an in-memory testing solution. So it's, in this case, it uses chef spec as a wrapper around RSpec. In fact, to even call the chef spec, you're writing in chef spec, and you got to have the chef spec gem, but you call it with RSpec from the command. It's an in-memory fake environment. It does do a converge on your cookbook in memory, and then you say, hey, if I was in this environment and I got this from, say, a data bag, and I got this information from, say, an environment, would it install Tomcat? Would it restart Tomcat if the properties file that I said if changes needs to restart Tomcat? Integration testing that's when you spin up a virtual machine and you do all the stuff in your cookbook, and then at the end you check if the stuff that you thought was supposed to happen happened. So it'd be like, did it install Apache? Is Apache user created? Is Apache running? Is it listening on port 80? Is it listening on port 443? Is it not listening on 80 because I wanted it to be on 443? And is this file there? Is this file got this content? Parse in there, do a match. It's Ruby, so you can really get crazy, but the basics are like 2-3 liners, and you can like check for a port. But you can get more complicated. It's Ruby, so you can go crazy with it. And again, the linting and the unit test is all in memory, and the integration test is run on an actual machine. Test-driven coding, the methodology or the idea of it is you write a test, you run the test, you see it fail, then you add the feature, then you run the test and see it pass. So like you write a test to say, hey, is Apache installed? Which you haven't put that in your cookbook yet. You run the test and it says, no, it's not installed. Then you add Apache, and then you run the test and it passes. So the first lab is going to be basically setting up your local environment and then creating your first cookbook and not doing too much coding. So the first thing you need to do, the first 3 things I guess you need to do, is install VirtualBox, Vagrant, and Chef DK. I have the versions specified there for a reason. When VirtualBox revs, other gems like Vagrant and so on and so forth need time to catch up to any changes that they've done. And so, for example, if you use 5.1 and use Vagrant 1.8.5, but you use, I believe that version 16.28 won't work with it. It'll have a SSH issue. I'm sure before too long, Chef DK, new release, and then you can bump up. But for right now, to guarantee that you're going to successfully get through this lab, make sure you put those versions on. So like 5.0.26 and Vagrant 1.8.4, not 1.8.5 because it won't work. So you might have a newer version on. You might need to downgrade it for doing this lab. And then, like I said, later, I'm sure they'll catch up and then be able to upgrade. But for right now, as of when I wrote this lab, you need to be at these versions. So I'd probably pause right now, get those installed, and then we could come back. Creating a working directory and configuring knife and creating cookbook and Burks and test kitchen and run your first lint, getting your first run, and then doing test-driven coding where you add something. In this case, we're going to add Apache, see it fail, then actually add Apache, do your lint test again, and then run Chef again and see it pass. It's going to be the bulk of the lab. So again, take a moment to make sure that you've installed VirtualBox Vagrant and Chef DK, and then go ahead and make a working directory. You can make it whatever you want. I'm just using this as an example. I'm doing this on a Mac. It should work the same on Linux. Windows and PowerShell would be a bit different, obviously. But basically make a directory that you're going to create a cookbook in, and then configure your knife with chef exec knife configure, and take the defaults. In my example, I had to change the user because I have a generic user, but just take the default, whatever your username is for the client name, and chef repo, you can point it to the directory that we created if you like. Generally, it isn't going to matter. It adds on cookbooks to the end of that directory, just so you know. And you can look at the file that's created. It's right, chef.chef/knife.rb. So let's make our first cookbook. First, we're gonna do, again, we're prefacing everything with chef exec. So it's chef exec knife cookbook create. We're just gonna call it cookbook foobar, and then the -o, small o, is for the path to put it in. So home chef cookbooks, and change to that directory, and then we're going to initialize Burkshelf and it's going to write a bunch of default files, skeleton files, and then we're going to go ahead and initialize test kitchen, which is kitchen in it, but it's not going to need to make any changes because Burks already makes it. I just wanted to show how you do that. And then delete some legacy files because we won't need the Vagrant file. We're not going to be doing definitions. That's the old way to do resources. We won't need the Thor file. Thing to note is with the way we're doing it is getting deprecated, the Chef Exec Knife Cookbook Create. They're replacing it with Chef Generate, but there's still some issues with it. It's still a little bit new, and there's a lot of workarounds you kind of need to do. Like if you wanted to do service spec, it won't work right out the gate. You got to do some manipulation. So I'm just trying to keep it simple to get you started, because really after you've started creating your own cookbooks and stuff, what you're probably going to do is have your example cookbook that you've wrote yourself or somebody else's, and you're just going to copy paste it into place, and it's going to have all the files that and folders that you want. Food critic space dot, meaning this directory. Again, you have to be in the root of the cookbook, which we called foobar, and you're going to get some errors that the maintainer email need to be updated, and you don't have a source URL and an issues URL. Pretty much put whatever you want. It's just parsing and looking for that exact uppercase that they have in there. So you can put your first name, last name, or company name, and then an email address or a fake email address just for the lab. And then at the end, we're going to append 2 lines, source underscore URL, and you don't have to have all those spaces. It's just 1 space. Single quote, because it's not going to be an interpreted line, meaning there's no variables in it that it needs to figure out. And you could either give it a real URL to your company GitHub, where you're going to upload the cookbook or not, and then put issues on the end of foobar, which I believe I do wrong in this video. It's supposed to be foobar slash issues. And then run food critic again, and hopefully it should pass. Or passed. It doesn't say that it passes, which is funny, but that's how it is. Now let's run Rubicop. It's the same syntax, just Rubicop dot. It's got some errors. Rubicop has an auto correct, so let's just do that. It's Chef Exec Rubicop -a dot, and you can see it corrected the 3 offenses, which basically they had double quotes instead of single quotes. Which with the Chef Generate, the files that you get, they pass Rubicop, but then it fails Food Critic because how they stub out the tests. But anyways, once you run that autocorrect and then run Rubicop again, it should pass. And with Rubicop, it actually tells you how many it inspected and if it passed or failed, which says no offenses detected, meaning it passed. So let's do our first run using Kitchen. We're gonna do Chef Exec Kitchen list to see it created a .kitchen.yaml by default, and in this case it's got 2 test suites, one that's basically Ubuntu and one that's CentOS 7.2. To see which ones are there without having to open up the YAML file, you just run kitchen list, or of course we're going to do Chef Exec Kitchen list. And then we're going to go ahead and build a virtual machine on VirtualBox Cent 7.2, and the command, again, you can skip ahead. We're going to go ahead and do the create and then do converge, which runs all your chef. So if you just do Chef Exec Kitchen converge, it's going to do the create and then converge, and then put the name of the test suite. Otherwise it's going to do both of them. It's going to create 2 virtual machines because there's 2 test suites. If you had 30 test suites or 10 test suites, it would make 30 or 10 virtual machines. So that's important to note, that you need to put the name after the command of the test suite that you want to do an action on, which includes logging in or destroying it or verifying it. Also a note, it does have like a built-in regex. So like if there's only, you might have 10 test suites, but only one of them is CentOS 7.2 or CentOS. Like in this case, there's only, out of the 2, only one of them uniquely has CentOS in the name, or even CEN in the name, you could write or type Chef Exec Kitchen Converge CentOS, and it would know which test suite you wanted. It would auto regex and say, oh, well, this is the only one that matches that. And that's going to create that VirtualBox virtual machine. And if you don't have the Vagrant box image for CentOS 7, there are bentos there created out there. You can Google it. There's GitHub where you can see a whole list of all the versions and OSs. Generally, it's CentOS, Ubuntu. I think they might have an OpenSUSE, might have a Debian, but you can look at the ones that are out there. But in the test kitchen, you just put the name and it goes and pulls down, CentOS 7.2, which there's a newer one, and you could say CentOS 7, whatever, 8, and it would go grab that. But if you don't, at first you got to get that box image, 300-400 megs, whatever it is, local. So Test Kitchen takes care of that for you. Well, it's actually writing into the Vagrant file, but anyways, it's going to go look at the standard bento, kind of like this Chef Supermarket, and say CentOS 7.2. Oh, this one matches, and it's going to download it locally for Vagrant. So, like, if you wanted to see what box images you have, or like clean them up, it's Vagrant space box space list to see them all, and then if you want to remove, it's like Vagrant box remove, and then the name. And then after that, after it creates it, then we'll log into it and see how that's really easy to log into. You just go kitchen login and the name of the test suite. As you can see right there's test suites. So here's the Vagrant box list. There's none. So that means when I first run this, it's going to download it. But then once you have it, you have it for the next time. So to make it faster for the next time. If needed, the user that you log into's name is Vagrant. It's a sudo user and its password is Vagrant. The root password is Vagrant as well. I fast forward to this. This is where it's actually downloading the CentOS 7.2 box image, and a couple of these sections I fast forwarded through, so you'll have pauses and stuff. It's normal. Right there, it downloaded the Chef client and installed it. Here's how you log in, Chef Exec Kitchen List, so you can see the names again. Okay, there's the name, Chef Exec Kitchen Login, well, or look at the Vagrant boxes. There's the Vagrant box downloaded. And then the login, you gotta make sure you put the, name. You could just do CentOS, but I'm typing the full name out just so that you see it. And also you could see that it says converged in the test kitchen list. So you know that there's a box running without even having to look at the VirtualBox. And you log in and poke around and whatnot, and then exit to get up. Now we're going to add a test, run it, and see it fail. So the test, it already created a folder called Test Integration Default. So you know that in the Kitchen YAML, the test suite is called default. That's why it said default CentOS or default Ubuntu. So like that name has to match the folder name under integration. So like if you changed it to mycool test, you'd have to change that default folder to mycool test. What we're going to do is create a folder underneath that called server spec, and that's where we're going to put our Ruby spec file. They can be named whatever you want as long as it ends in _spec and then .rb. So it could be mycool test _spec.rb. It just iterates through. If you look at the gem for anything in the test suite directory, which in this case is called default, and under server spec, and iterates through anything _spec. Make sure you have that spec under server spec. If you have it under default, it will just skip past it and not run it. The syntax we're putting in there, just keeping it simple right now with no helpers, require server spec, just the gem, and then set the backend, execute, describe. You can name that whatever you want. We're going to be adding Apache 2 to be specific. So I named it Apache 2. And The it is the test. It's integration test. So the Apache installation, again, that's whatever you want to name it, and then that syntax, the expect package HTTPD to be installed is server spec specific DSL basically. So we're going to check that HTTPD gets installed, that it's running, and that it's listening on port 80. Then we're going to lint it. So we're going to do food critic, we're going to do RuboCop, and fix anything that we might have wrong. Which after using RuboCop for a while, you'll learn like you need an empty line at the end of all your Ruby files, and only one space between, and a space after the comment hash and stuff like that. So we create the directory, and then we create the file. I'm using Vim. Obviously, you could use whatever you want, Atom, or really what I use is JetBrains products. Put in the content, make sure you have the line at the end, or RuboCop's going to be pissed, save it, run verify to see a fail. But since the virtual machine is already running, what it's doing is going and doing this. You said verify, so it wasn't already set up. So it did the setup phase, which was download all the gems needed for the test framework, and then took your test and ran it. Now, if you make a change to your test and you run verify again, it will upload your test. It just won't make changes to your cookbook. If you made a change to your cookbook, you'd have to do converge, but you can make a change or add test, and all you do is verify, make a change, verify, make another change, verify, add, remove, whatever. You can see here that it finished in, whatever, really fast, and 3 examples, 3 failed. And if you scroll up, you could see each of the individual ones under Apache 2 that failed, which is all of them. Now we're going to add the Apache 2 Community Cookbook as a dependency in the metadata.rb. Again, when we find that, we're going to the Chef supermarket and searching for Apache, and you'd see the name was Apache 2. And now we're going to call the recipe from within the default recipe. So recipes, default RB, add include underscore recipe space single quote Apache 2. And you may notice that there's no recipe at the end of it. It's just Apache 2. By default, it assumes Apache 2 : default. Then run food critic. Looks good. Run RuboCop. Looks good. Now we'll run kitchen converge to upload our cookbook changes to the virtual machine. And be sure to specify the test suite name, which is default CentOS 7, or you could just do CentOS. Now it should go through and run through the Apache default recipe, which will install Apache 2. Now we'll run kitchen verify to run the server spec test now that Apache is installed. And there you have it. All 3 tests passed. 0 failures. And if you do a kitchen list, you'll see that it's successfully verified. And now that we're completed with the lab, you can destroy the virtual machine using Chef Exec Kitchen destroy and then the test suite name. Some troubleshooting tips. Again, make sure that you have the correct versions that are specified, or you're just going to cause yourself a headache. And some of the errors you might see if you have a newer version is like SSH or authentication errors, so check your version. Also, make sure you just use your username when you're setting up the kitchen config, not the chef user, the generic one that I'm using. If your destroy fails for the VirtualBox, make sure you don't have the extensions installed. That seems to cause issues, and whenever I take those off, I don't have a problem. When I have them on, it's hit or miss on versioning if it works or not. So that might be the first thing you try, is if you have the extensions, take those off. But once it fails, what you're gonna have to do is you just do the destroy, and it's gonna clean up your kitchen. Your .kitchen folder has tracking of, you know, all the different ports and IPs and everything. And when you do destroy, it's gonna wipe it out of there. And you go into VirtualBox and you stop it, and then remove it, delete files, so you manually have to delete it. So hopefully now you've learned the fundamentals of Chef and set up your local dev environment and created your first cookbook using test-driven coding. I hope this video helped you with getting started with Chef, and you look for the subsequent videos to continue your training.